The salvage ship, Kethmaran, drifted through the debris field like a scavenger picking through bones. Captain Zixtal's 4 arms worked the controls with practiced ease, his reptilian eyes scanning the holographic display for anything worth collecting. The wreckage of the ancient human battleship had been floating in this forgotten corner of space for over 3 centuries, and most salvage crews had picked it clean decades ago. There! His navigator Kel pointed with one of her tentacles toward a section that appeared intact. That module looks untouched. Zixtal nodded, maneuvering their ship closer. The human vessel had been massive, easily 10 times the size of their salvage craft. Even in its broken state, the alien architecture impressed him. Humans had built their ships differently than any other species in the galaxy, brutal, efficient, and somehow elegant in their simplicity. "Docking clamps engaged," announced their engineer, a crystalline being named Thresh. "Atmosphere shows breathable for most of our crew. The humans used standard galactic mix in their ships." The salvage team suited up and entered the human vessel through an airlock that still functioned after all these years. Emergency lighting flickered on automatically, casting eerie shadows down corridors that had once bustled with human activity. Zixtal had salvaged enough human ships to know their layout. This appeared to be an engineering section. "Stay together," he ordered his team of 6. "Human ships sometimes have automated defenses that activate when boarded." They moved carefully through the corridors, their various forms of locomotion creating a symphony of clicks, slithers, and footfalls on the metal decking. The humans had built everything oversized by galactic standards, doorways that could accommodate beings twice as tall as most species, corridors wide enough for entire families to walk abreast. "Captain," Kel's translator crackled, "I'm reading massive energy signatures from deeper in the ship. Whatever powered this vessel, it's still active." That was unusual. Most human ships had been thoroughly stripped of their power cores by previous salvage operations. Zixtal's interest peaked. An intact human power system could net them enough credits to retire. They followed the energy readings deeper into the ship, past what appeared to be crew quarters and recreational areas. The humans had lived well on their vessels, Zixtal noted. Each room was spacious and comfortable, designed for long voyages between stars. The energy signatures led them to a massive chamber that hummed with barely contained power. Banks of consoles lined the walls, their displays dark except for occasional flickers of light. In the center of the room stood something that made Zixtal's scales tingle with unease. It was a cylindrical column reaching from floor to ceiling, perhaps 3 meters in diameter. The surface was smooth metal, but it pulsed with an inner light that shifted through colors Zixtal had no names for. Most disturbing of all, on a pedestal next to the column sat a single switch. It was crude by galactic standards, just a simple toggle mechanism, but it glowed with the same unsettling light as the column. "What do you think it is?" whispered Thresh, her crystalline form refracting the strange light into rainbow patterns. Before Zixtal could respond, a voice echoed through the chamber. It spoke in heavily accented galactic standard, the words carrying an odd inflection that marked it as human speech. "Attention alien salvagers. This is Engineering Chief Marcus Webb of the UES Retribution." The salvage team spun around, weapons drawn, but the chamber remained empty except for themselves and the mysterious column. "If you are hearing this message," the voice continued, "then you have entered the ship's primary reactor control room. I need to make something very clear to you. Under no circumstances should you touch, activate, or even approach the red switch on the pedestal." Zixtal looked at his team. The switch wasn't red. It glowed with that same shifting, unnatural light. But human color perception was different from most species. "The device you see before you is not a standard reactor," the human voice explained. 3 months ago, we encountered something in the void between stars. Something that should not exist. Our scientists called it a dimensional cascade generator. We tried to study it, to understand it. The message paused, and when it resumed, the human's voice carried a note of barely controlled fear. We were wrong to try. The device doesn't generate power in any conventional sense. It tears holes in reality itself, drawing energy from somewhere else. Somewhere that things live that were never meant to exist in our universe. Kel's tentacles writhed nervously. Captain, perhaps we should leave. This doesn't sound like standard salvage. But Zixtal was fascinated. Dimensional technology was purely theoretical for most galactic species. If the humans had actually built a working dimensional manipulator, it would be the greatest archaeological find in centuries. The switch, the recording continued, activates the cascade. When we first triggered it, we opened a small rift. What came through? The human's voice broke slightly. We lost 6 crew members before we could shut it down. The things that killed them weren't entirely physical. They fed on consciousness itself, leaving behind empty shells that looked like our friends, but contained nothing human. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Thresh's crystalline form had stopped refracting light, instead absorbing it as if afraid to draw attention. We tried to destroy the device, the human continued. Nothing worked. Plasma cutters, explosives, even a focused antimatter beam. The column absorbed everything we threw at it. That's when we realized the truth. The device isn't just powered by dimensional energy. It's alive. It wants to be activated. The voice paused again, and when it resumed, it carried the weight of desperation. We've sealed the reactor chamber and set the ship to drift. I'm recording this message as our final act before abandoning ship. If anyone finds this vessel, please, for the sake of every living thing in this galaxy, do not press that switch. The device is patient. It can wait centuries for someone curious enough to activate it. Don't be that someone. The message ended with the soft hiss of a recording system shutting down. The salvage team stood in silence for several minutes, staring at the innocuous-looking switch. It pulsed gently, almost hypnotically, and Zixtal found his eyes drawn to it despite his growing unease. "We should leave," Kel said finally. "Whatever credits we might gain aren't worth the risk." But Thresh had moved closer to the console, her crystalline form reflecting the switch's glow. "Think about it logically," she said, her translated voice carrying an odd harmonic. "The human spoke of fear and superstition, but look at this technology. Dimensional manipulation could revolutionize galactic civilization. We could solve the energy crisis, open new trade routes, even explore parallel universes." "The human said his people died," Zixtal reminded her, but he found himself taking a step closer to the switch as well. "Humans were primitive compared to us," Thresh countered. "They lacked the scientific understanding to properly control the device. We've studied dimensional theory for millennia. We could succeed where they failed." The switch pulsed brighter, and Zixtal could swear he heard something calling to him from beyond the edge of perception. A whisper that promised knowledge, power, and secrets beyond imagination. "Captain," Kel's voice carried a note of alarm. "Something's wrong. The energy readings are increasing. The device is responding to our presence." She was right. The column's glow had intensified, and the air around the switch shimmered as if heated. But rather than feeling dangerous, it felt inviting. "One small activation," Thresh murmured, reaching toward the switch. "Just to see what happens. We could revolutionize everything." Zixtal found himself nodding. The human's warnings seemed less important now, overshadowed by the incredible opportunity before them. His hand moved toward the switch, drawn by an irresistible urge to discover what lay beyond the dimensional barrier. The moment Zixtal's claw touched the switch, reality screamed. The chamber filled with light that wasn't light, sound that wasn't sound, and a sensation of falling upward through dimensions that had no names. The column erupted in brilliant energy, its surface rippling like liquid mercury as something vast and alien pressed against the barriers between worlds. Zixtal tried to pull his hand away, but the switch held him fast. Energy coursed through his nervous system, and suddenly his mind was flooded with images from the human crew's final days. He saw through their eyes as the first rift opened, watched in horror as creatures of living shadow poured through the dimensional breach. The beings weren't entirely physical. They existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions where different physical laws applied. They moved like liquid darkness, but their touch could freeze a star or ignite a vacuum. And they were hungry, not for food or energy, but for consciousness itself. In the human memories, Zixtal watched a young engineer named Sarah Kim realize too late what they had unleashed. The shadow creatures flowed around her, and her scream cut off abruptly as something fundamental was ripped from her body. When the darkness receded, she still stood there, still breathed, still moved. But her eyes were empty windows looking into nothing. "Captain!" Kel's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You need to release the switch." But Zixtal couldn't. The device held him in its grip, showing him more memories, more warnings. He saw Marcus Webb, the engineering chief whose voice they'd heard, working frantically to shut down the cascade. The human had understood something crucial about the device that Zixtal was only now beginning to grasp. The column wasn't just a dimensional manipulator, it was a trap. Somewhere in the spaces between realities, ancient intelligences had built snares for younger species. They scattered these devices across the galaxy, waiting for curious civilizations to activate them. Each activation opened a doorway that could never be fully closed, allowing the shadow beings to seep slowly into normal space. The humans had activated their device 3 times before realizing the truth. Each time, the rift had been a little larger, a little harder to close. The shadow creatures had grown stronger with each feeding, and now they waited just beyond the dimensional barrier, pressing against the weakening walls of reality. "Thresh, help me!" Kel was shouting now, her tentacles wrapped around Zixtal's torso, trying to pull him away from the switch. But Thresh stood transfixed, staring at the column as its glow intensified. Her crystalline form had begun to resonate with the dimensional energy, creating harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "Can you see them?" she whispered. "They're beautiful." Through the translucent walls of the column, shapes moved in the space beyond. They flowed like oil and shifted like smoke, but there was intelligence in their movements. Ancient, patient intelligence that had watched civilizations rise and fall across countless eons. One of the shadow beings pressed against the dimensional barrier, and Zixtal felt its attention focus on him. It spoke without words, communicating through pure thought that bypassed his translator entirely. "Release us," it whispered in his mind. "We offer such gifts, knowledge of the deep spaces between stars. Technologies that could elevate your species beyond all others. We have watched you struggle with the crude sciences of matter and energy. We offer mastery of consciousness itself." For a moment, Zixtal was tempted. The creature's promises were seductive, offering solutions to problems his species had wrestled with for millennia. But the human memories provided a counterpoint. Images of empty-eyed crew members stumbling through the ship's corridors, their consciousness devoured to fuel the shadow being's existence in normal space. The device pulsed brighter, and hairline cracks appeared in the air around the column. Reality was beginning to fracture under the dimensional strain. "Captain!" Kel's desperation cut through the alien whispers. "The containment is failing. If this rift opens fully, these things will spread throughout the galaxy." Zixtal tried to focus on her words, but the shadow being's presence in his mind grew stronger. He saw flashes of other worlds, other species that had activated similar devices. a proud aquatic civilization that had ruled 3 star systems, reduced to mindless husks floating in their underwater cities. A hive mind that had spanned 100 worlds, its collective consciousness harvested to feed the shadow's hunger for awareness. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the creature informed him. "The device responds to desire, and you desired to activate it. That desire was enough to weaken the barriers. Soon we will walk in your reality, and your galaxy will know the peace of empty thought." But even as the shadow being spoke, Zixtal felt another presence in his mind. This one was different, smaller, more familiar, human. "Don't listen to them," a voice said. It was Marcus Webb, the engineering chief whose message they'd heard. Somehow his consciousness had become entangled with the device during his attempts to shut it down. "I've been trapped here for 3 centuries, keeping them from opening the rift fully. But I can't hold them much longer." The human's mental presence was fading, worn thin by centuries of constant struggle against the shadow beings, but his determination remained unbroken. "There is a way to stop them," Webb continued. "But it requires a sacrifice. Someone has to stay connected to the device, maintaining the containment from the inside. I've been doing it since my ship was abandoned, but I'm almost gone. I need someone to take my place." Zixtal understood. The device couldn't be destroyed, but it could be contained. Someone had to remain linked to it, using their own consciousness as a barrier against the shadow beings. The human engineer had been holding that line for 300 years, slowly burning away his own existence to keep the galaxy safe. "I can't ask you to do this," Webb's voice whispered. "But if you don't, these things will consume every thinking being in the galaxy. They've done it before, in other galaxies, other dimensions. This is how they spread, one device at a time, one curious species at a time." The column pulsed again, and more cracks appeared in the surrounding air. Through the gaps, Zixtal could see the space beyond, a realm of shifting shadows and impossible geometries where the shadow beings gathered in vast numbers, waiting for their chance to enter normal space. Thresh stepped closer to the column, her crystalline form now glowing with the same energy as the device. "I can feel them calling," she said dreamily. "They want to show us wonders beyond imagination." "Thresh, no!" Kel lunged for their engineer, but it was too late. The crystalline being placed one faceted hand on the column's surface and immediately began to scream. The shadow beings poured into her through the connection, devouring her consciousness with savage hunger. Her crystal form darkened as her awareness was consumed, leaving behind a hollow shell that mimicked life but contained no spark of sentience. The dimensional rift widened. "Now do you understand?" Webb's mental voice was barely a whisper. "This is what they do. They feed on consciousness, leaving behind empty shells that still function but no longer truly live. If they escape into your galaxy, every thinking being will suffer the same fate." Zixtal made his choice. He stopped fighting the device's hold on him and instead embraced it, letting his consciousness flow into the dimensional matrix. The shadow beings recoiled as his mind joined with Webb's, reinforcing the barriers that held them back. "Thank you," Webb said as his presence finally faded away. 300 years is long enough. The watch is yours now." As the human engineer's consciousness dissipated, Zixtal felt the full weight of containment settle on his mind. The shadow beings pressed against his defenses, probing for weaknesses, whispering promises and threats in equal measure. But he held firm, using his own life force to maintain the dimensional barriers. "Captain?" Kel reached for him, but he shook his head. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice already taking on the hollow quality of someone caught between dimensions. I have to stay connected. It's the only way to keep them contained. The rift began to shrink as Zixtal's will imposed itself on the dimensional matrix. The shadow beings retreated, but he could feel their patient malevolence. They would wait, as they had waited for Webb, slowly wearing away at his defenses until another successor was needed. Kel stood frozen in the chamber, watching her captain's transformation with growing horror. Zixtal's scales had begun to take on the same translucent quality as the column, and his eyes reflected depths that seemed to extend far beyond his skull. He was still alive, still aware, but no longer entirely present in their reality. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Until my consciousness burns out completely," Zixtal replied, his voice carrying strange harmonics. "Could be decades, could be centuries. The human lasted 300 years, but his species had different mental structures. I might last longer, or—" He shrugged with one of his forearms. "Time works differently when you're partially existing in 7 dimensions at once." The hollow shell that had been Thresh moved with mechanical precision, checking readings on consoles with no understanding of what the displays meant. Her crystal form still functioned, but the intelligence that had driven it was gone, consumed by the shadow being's insatiable hunger. "We have to warn the others," Kel said. "Other salvage crews will come here eventually. They need to know what this device really is." Zixtal nodded, though the motion seemed to cause him physical pain. "Yes, but more than that, we need to find the other devices. The shadow beings have scattered hundreds of these traps throughout the galaxy. Some are hidden in ancient ruins, others drift in space like this one. Each represents a potential invasion point." He gestured toward one of the still-functioning consoles. "The humans' records are all here. Webb spent years cataloging dimensional signatures, trying to map the location of every device he could detect. It became his obsession after he realized what his crew had unleashed." Kel approached the console carefully, noting how the air seemed thicker near the column. Reality itself was strained in this space, bent by forces that existed beyond normal physics. The human text scrolled across the screen in neat, precise lines, a testament to Webb's methodical mind, even as he fought an impossible battle. "There are coordinates here," she said, tentacles dancing across the alien controls. "Dozens of them. Some marked as confirmed devices, others as suspected locations." "Take the data," Zixtal urged. "Share it with the Galactic Council. They need to understand what we're dealing with. These aren't just ancient artifacts. They're weapons in a war that's been going on since before our civilizations existed." As Kel downloaded the human records, she noticed something that made her secondary heart skip a beat. "Captain, some of these coordinates, they're in inhabited systems. One device is apparently hidden beneath the capital city of Nexus Prime." The implications were staggering. If shadow beings were already operating from those locations, they could be slowly corrupting the leadership of entire civilizations. Empty shells that looked and acted like living beings, but served the agenda of entities from beyond normal space. "That explains the recent political shifts," Zixtal mused, his perception now spanning multiple dimensions simultaneously. "The Confederation's sudden turn toward isolationism, the trade guild's increasingly aggressive policies. If key leaders have been replaced by shells—" A new thought occurred to Kel, one that chilled her to her core. "How do we know we haven't been compromised already? How can we tell who's real and who's been consumed?" Before Zixtal could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. The dimensional readings spiked wildly, and the column's glow intensified to painful levels. "They're making another push," Zixtal gasped, his form flickering between dimensions. "The shadow beings are trying to overwhelm my defenses while I'm distracted. I need to focus all my attention on containment." Through the translucent walls of the column, Kel could see the dark shapes pressing against the barriers with renewed fury. They had sensed weakness in the containment and were exploiting it ruthlessly. "Go," Zixtal commanded, his voice becoming hollow and distant. "Take the data and get out of here. If the containment fails while you're still aboard, the shadow beings will consume your consciousness before you can warn anyone." Kel hesitated, unwilling to abandon her captain. But she understood the logic. Someone had to carry the warning to the wider galaxy, and she was the only crew member still capable of rational thought. "What about Thresh?" she asked, looking at the empty shell of their engineer. "Leave her. The body still functions, but there's nothing left to save. The real Thresh died the moment she touched the column." With heavy hearts and heavier tentacles, Kel gathered the human data and fled the chamber. Behind her, she could hear Zixtal's voice raised in what might have been a battle cry or a death song, his consciousness struggling against entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. The journey back to their salvage ship felt like an eternity. Every shadow seemed to reach for her, and every reflection looked wrong, as if the shadow beings were already beginning to influence local space. She sealed the airlocks behind her and initiated emergency departure protocols, pushing their ship's engines beyond safe parameters in her haste to escape. Only when they were several light minutes away from the human wreckage did she allow herself to breathe normally. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her from that cursed vessel. The data she carried painted a terrifying picture of galactic infiltration spanning millennia. The shadow beings were patient beyond measure, willing to wait centuries between actions if necessary. They had been slowly corrupting civilizations throughout the galaxy, replacing key figures with empty shells and gradually steering entire species toward behaviors that would make them easier to consume. The recent wave of isolationism sweeping through galactic politics wasn't a natural development, it was orchestrated. By keeping species separated and suspicious of each other, the shadow beings prevented the kind of coordinated response that might threaten their operations. Kel's first stop was the nearest Galactic Council way station, a diplomatic outpost that served as a neutral meeting ground for various species. She transmitted the human data to the Council's archives and requested an emergency session with the Security Committee. The response was swift but troubling. The committee agreed to review her evidence, but their reply seemed oddly formal, lacking the urgency she expected. Worse, several committee members she had dealt with before seemed different somehow, their communication patterns slightly off, their responses unnaturally precise. How long had the infiltration been going on? How many of the galaxy's leaders were already shells, their consciousness consumed and replaced by alien will? She decided to take a different approach. Rather than working through official channels, she began reaching out to independent researchers and freelance investigators. Scientists who operated outside government oversight, journalists who specialized in exposing cover-ups, and military officers who had noticed strange patterns in recent political developments. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of beings came forward with stories of loved ones who had changed overnight, of leaders making decisions that contradicted everything they had previously stood for, of entire research teams disappearing after investigating certain archaeological sites. A pattern emerged from the chaos. The shadow beings had been active for centuries, but their operations had accelerated dramatically in recent decades. They were preparing for something big, a final phase that would complete their conquest of the galaxy. Working with her new allies, Kel began to piece together the shadow beings' strategy. The devices scattered throughout the galaxy weren't just individual invasion points. They were part of a network. When enough of them were activated simultaneously, they would create a galaxy-spanning rift that would allow the shadow beings to pour through in unlimited numbers. The humans aboard the Retribution had stumbled onto this truth during their research. Webb's final logs revealed that he had detected synchronization signals between the various devices, growing stronger each year as more of them came online. According to his calculations, the network was approaching critical mass. When it reached the tipping point, every device would activate simultaneously, and the galaxy would be flooded with shadow beings. The few pockets of genuine consciousness that remained would be quickly overwhelmed and consumed. But the humans had also discovered something else, a way to disrupt the network. If someone could reach the primary control node, the master device that coordinated all the others, they could potentially shut down the entire system. The location of this node was hidden in the deepest levels of the human data, encrypted with codes that had taken Webb years to develop. Kel stared at the coordinates when she finally decrypted them. The primary control node wasn't hidden on some distant world or drifting in empty space. It was located at the very heart of galactic civilization, beneath the Galactic Council chambers themselves. The shadow beings hadn't just been infiltrating the government. They had built their control center directly under the seat of galactic power, using the Council's own security measures to protect their most vital installation. The irony was bitter. For centuries, the galaxy's leaders had unknowingly been meeting directly above the source of their eventual destruction. Every law passed, every treaty signed, every decision made had been observed by entities that planned to consume every conscious being in the galaxy. But now, Kel knew the truth, and she wasn't alone. Her network of allies had grown to include beings from dozens of species, all united by the knowledge of what they faced. They called themselves the Continuants, dedicated to preserving genuine consciousness against the shadow beings' hunger. The final confrontation was inevitable. They would have to assault the very heart of galactic government, fighting through layers of security, both technological and political. Many of the guards and officials protecting the council chambers would be genuine beings doing their duty. Others would be empty shells, serving masters that existed beyond normal space. The challenge would be telling them apart. As Kel prepared for what might be the last free action taken by conscious beings in the galaxy, she thought of Zixtal, still holding his vigil aboard the human wreckage. His sacrifice had bought them time to discover the truth, but time was running out. The shadow beings had been patient for eons, but their patience was finally at an end. Soon, every device in their network would activate, and the galaxy would learn why civilizations across the universe had fallen silent. Their worlds left populated only by empty shells that moved through the motions of life without ever truly living. The war for consciousness itself was about to begin, and Kel intended to make sure that genuine thought and feeling would survive, no matter the cost.